folks, welcome back. I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading. I thought I'd give you a quickish update on my reading in the first week or so of January. I've read a couple of novels that are polar opposites in the way they're put together. So the first one I finished was Rose MacAulay's Towers of Trebizond. And MacAulay is one of my favorite writers, and this is one of her late novels. I think it's actually the last novel she completed. She published it in 1956 and died in 1958 after a long life. So it's a novel that most people agree has a fabulous opening line. The opening line is, "Take my camel, dear," which is a great opening line to a novel that's about the travels of Dot, Father Hugh, and the narrator, Laurie, through Turkey. Dot is traveling to Turkey because she travels lots and is very interested in women's rights and women's suffrage. She's interested in liberating the women of Turkey. Father Hugh is largely a comic figure, and he's interested in making sure that he converts Muslims to a very particular kind of Christianity, high Anglicanism. And Laurie is the narrator. Laurie earns a living by writing and is there to accompany Dot and provide content for the book Dot's writing and sketches. And they do travel by camel and by jeep all through Turkey. And it's got a lot of characteristic MacAulay touches to it. The writing is very detailed. The prose style includes lots of elaborate sentences, interesting verbal choices. MacAulay is one of those writers who I often find a word used in a sentence that I've not come across before, so it's fabulous kind of reading to do for that purposes. The most interesting thing to me about the novel is how reticent MacAulay is about Laurie's gender. Laurie is in the midst of an affair with a married person named Veer, and by the end of the novel we discover that Veer is male. But for most of the novel, in fact all of the novel, Laurie is not referred to by any gender at all. Most critics assume that Laurie is female because the novel is thought to be modeled on MacAulay and her relationship with Gerald O'Donovan, a man she was in relationship with for about 20 years while he was married to another woman. It's an odd novel. It didn't sit quite right with me, but I think that's more a problem with me as a reader than a problem with the novel. I think it's got lots of comedy, lots of social satire, lots of cultural satire, lots and lots of travel description and description of scenery and monuments that have passed, monuments that are still there. And I think that's the thing that tripped me up as a reader. I didn't have much patience for the travelogue part of the novel. But I think you might enjoy this novel if you like novels that have lots of travel description, if you're interested in satires of Christianity that are combined with a character like Laurie who's trying to figure out what religious faith means to them. And I think it's the kind of novel that would repay a close reading with attention to gender dynamics in the novel. It's a good novel, but it just didn't wow me, which is a little bit of a disappointment given how much I like MacAulay's writing. The other novel I finished this last week is entirely different kind of novel, but it also deals with similarly unconventional women. I finished Eve Babitz, L.A. Woman, which was published in 1982, I believe. And it trades a little bit on Babitz's reputation as Jim Morrison's girlfriend, and the narrator, Sophie Lubin, in the novel is the girlfriend of a man named Jim at some point, or it's alluded to. So it's got this lure of autobiographical glamour, I guess would be the word you'd use for it. It tells the story of Sophie, who, as a young girl growing up in Hollywood to about maybe her mid-20s, and it tells her story, so a story of women growing up in the 60s and 70s in LA, and couples it with the story of the previous generation or generation and a half, so the story of Sophie's mother and Sophie's mother's friends and relatives, female friends and relatives. The women in the novel all live fairly unconventional lives. They all escape from domestic boundaries in some way. They all escape from traditional marriage plots, essentially, and all seem to have lived happy lives outside of that marriage plot. And I think that's part of what Babitz is getting at, how you live a happy, if tumultuous life in LA, in Hollywood. And it's extraordinarily different than MacAulay's book. MacAulay writes with such great precision around language, and her sentences are always structured very precisely, and they're often, especially in the travel log section of it in some of MacAulay's essays, they're often very long sentences with multiple clauses and subclauses. Babitz's sentences are similarly long and intricate, but they're not always grammatically sound. They're much looser, and she's not afraid of sentence fragments at all. And the first couple of times you read through some of these sentences, at least for me, it's a little off-putting, like, okay, the subject of this sentence seems to have shifted from the beginning of it to the end of it, and how does a sentence fragment relate to the previous sentence? But once I got past the first 50 pages or so, maybe not even 50 pages, you fall into the rhythm of it, and it's a very loose narrative style, which kind of goes with kind of loose, sketchy lives she's describing. So I quite enjoyed it. I suspect it's not Babitz's best novel, but it was quite enjoyable. And I think if you've read The 7 Lives of Evelyn Hugo, which was the Ray John Booktube last year, the year before, you might like Babitz. It's a very different take on the same kind of cultural milieu and a very different narrative style. Jenkins Reid is much more traditional narrative shape to it. Babitz is a little bit all over the place, which I quite enjoyed. Babitz also reminds me a little bit of Eileen Miles's writing. It's a little bit similar in tone and approach in its kind of scatteredness as Chelsea Girls, although it's much less dire than some of the things that you'll find taking place in Chelsea Girls, which is also a great novel. What else did I finish? I finished Samuel Dittison's Arsenals of Democratic Culture. This is a standard volume of library history. It was published in 1947, and it hasn't aged well. It's really caught up in the militaristic rhetoric of the period, not surprisingly, but it's a standard kind of library history for the United States. Not a hard read, not something I would strongly recommend to anybody unless you are dead mad keen on library history. So that's what I've completed as part of January, and all of those are books that I had either borrowed or already had on my shelf, so that's progress on my no buy, no borrow project for January. No buy, no borrow is hard. In progress this week, I have Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, like dozens of other people on YouTube. I'm rereading or reading for the first time Wolf Hall, and man, I love this novel. It's my second time reading it, and there's just something about Mantel's prose. It's as if she's managed to put into the prose this concept of sprezzatura, which comes from Castiglione's Courtier, and is looking at how that concept of sprezzatura is exemplified by Cromwell, and somehow that is inflected in the prose. It's all very bright and glittering and courtly, and so very telling in its way that it explores character. Still a big fan of this novel. The other one I'm making way with is the second volume of Sigrid Undset's trilogy. So I'll make my way through The Mistress of Husaby, and it's suffering in comparison to the Mantel. I'm struggling with it. I'm about a quarter of the way through, so I'm going to carry on, but I'm struggling at this stage in it with the emphasis on sinfulness and penitence, which just isn't my thing, and it really is suffering in comparison to Mantel in my reading. But I can see why the novel itself was particularly popular in the 20s when it was published, when the kinds of ordinary human behavior, premarital sex, sex outside of marriage, people living together without being married, would have been more shocking to conventional audiences. So I can see that in the novel. I'm hoping that I'll get back into the rhythm of reading it and not be so distracted by the difference between it and the Mantel. The other piece I'm working my way through this week is Art Manuel's Unsettling Canada. This is a straightforward, clear, easy to read account. It's kind of a political history of Canada from an Indigenous point of view. It's all constructed so far on a autobiographical line. He attaches the moments of Indigenous political history to his own life. He and his father were both very active in Indigenous politics in Canada. So that narrative approach, attaching it to a personal life story, makes it easy to read, easy to understand, and easy to orient yourself in time. If you can figure out where you stood in time in relationship to Manuel's life history, easier to kind of get a sense of what else was going on in Canada at the time that he's describing various political interventions. The thing I'm struggling with it is a little bit is the absence of Indigenous women and Indigenous women's issues. Maybe they'll appear more strongly in the next chunk of the book that I read, but I'm not holding my breath on it based on Manuel's dismissal of the importance of family law. He attended Osgoode Law School but didn't complete, and the course he highlights as having not been completed was a course in family law, that his belief was that it wasn't important. And that is kind of a tell, potentially, of the position of women in his account, but we'll see. I'll get through the end of it. I'm about a third of the way through, maybe not even that. I'm enjoying it largely because it's filling in gaps in my understanding of Canadian history, and that's always a very welcome thing. That is my reading for the week. Some good reading, some ordinary reading, some reading that I just have to be patient with. The best, I think, of the batch that I'm reading so far is the Mantel and the Babitz, interestingly enough. It's the one that's made me want to go out and find another couple of Babitz books to read, but no buy, no borrow, no borrow. I hope you've had a fabulous reading week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.